Welcome to our next lecture. We are up to chapter 46 in the Pines. That would be page, I think it's actually page 46. If that, I guess, no, I'm sorry, page 97 in the Pines translation. And Rambam is going to take a long break from translating words now, and he's going to give me 1 second. He's going to continue on the theme and the idea that when we read the Torah, when we read the words of Tanakh, when we read Chazal, that we have to understand that even though it uses terms that make it sound like God has human qualities, but we have to understand that that's not what it's meant. So now that he gave us a whole bunch of words and translations, now he's going to get more into the philosophical details of how this works. You know, how it is that when we read the Torah, we have to interpret the verses to mean what Rambam is trying to teach us God is truly like. So we already studied the beginning of chapter 46 when we did chapter 33 together. That's probably going back a couple months ago, but I'm going to do it again now just for the sake of being consistent and moving forward. And if it sounds familiar, that's fine. So I'm going to start reading from the Pines. So we have mentioned, Rambam says, in one of the chapters of this treatise, that was 33, we did this together, that there is an immense difference between guidance leading to a knowledge of the existence of a thing. I'll put this into modern English in a minute, right? And an investigation of the true reality of the essence and substance of the thing. So what Rambam is saying is that if you want to prove that something exists, there's a huge difference between describing the actual essence of that something which you want to describe, and between that and proving from circumstances that such a thing exists. So, for example, let's say you want to, I think a good modern example is you want to teach someone that there's such a thing as the coronavirus, for example. So you prove it by demonstrating that people are getting sick. It's clearly getting transmitted in a certain way. And the more you learn about this virus, they get the same symptoms. People that are together seem to get these same symptoms and so on. So you can infer, based on the modern knowledge that we have of virology and so on, that there's a virus causing this illness. But you're not describing the essence of the virus. You're not describing what it looks like under a microscope, what the molecular structure of it is, and so on. So the essence of the thing is referring to the actual essence of the virus, the molecular structure of it, whereas all of the circumstances that you prove that it does exist is something else. So it's similar when one describes God, the only main difference being that one can never get to the point where one can describe God's molecular structure, so to speak, right? Because that's something that we can't understand, but we can infer the existence of God through all of the things that are described in the Torah and are described in the world that we see in the world around us. And that's really the bottom line of what he's about to say in a little more length, but let's go into it. Because Rambam is going to give us some examples to understand it. The reason is that guidance leading to the knowledge of the existence of a thing can be had. In other words, even if that should be through the accidents of a thing or through its acts or through a relation. In other words, you can infer the existence of a virus based on all kinds of things without ever actually having a microscope under which you can see the virus, right? The term accidents refers to the things that being happens to make happen, right? So a virus happens to make us sick. That would be the accidents. So we can, or you can also infer the existence of something based on its relationship to us, right? Based on the things that it does, the way it's experienced. For instance, and here's an example. You may recall when we read this last time, if you wish to make known the rule of a certain region of the earth to one of the people of that ruler's country who does not know him, you want to describe that there's a king of this area, right? So you can tell him about that person and try to describe him in many different ways.
One of them consists in you're saying the ruler he's tall, and describe his essence. He's a tall guy. He's got he's white in skin color. He has gray hair. Like, describe physical characteristics about him. Thus, you would make him known through his accidents, through things that happen to be about him. But you can also point to him. You can say, look, when the guy rides in the big chariot in the street, right, and surrounded by his whole entourage, right, and people with soldiers and swords and banners and flags and trumpets and so on, so you can say, and you can describe him that way, or you can say he's the guy that lives in the castle. So in other words, you're describing things about him, right? Or you may mention, he's the king that won this and this battle, or he's the king that did such and such, whatever thing he's bragging about. Or you can try to say something else. You can look at the circumstances around you and prove that there must be a king that rules this place. So, for example, because we did this, I'm going to do this rather quick. Remember, we're on page 97, right? He says, if someone says, is there a king in this country? Is there somebody that rules? Is there anyone in charge? Right? And he says, well, look, here, if you have a guy sitting here on the table with a lot of money, and he's a money changer in the marketplace, and you have a poor man walking in front of him, and there's nobody there to stop the poor man from grabbing all that money and running, right? So why doesn't he do that? Clearly, he doesn't do it because we see that the commerce is happening peacefully here. Obviously, they're afraid of an authority. So you describe, based on the circumstances that you're seeing, that there must be an authority. So, or if you see that, so Rambam gives that an example. I'm kind of skipping to the end of that page. I'm turning now to page 98. So the bottom line of that all is that now in all that we have up at the top of page 98, said by way of parable, there is nothing to give an indication of the ruler's essence. So if you describe by saying, look at the way people are acting, it must be someone's in charge, or there must be a king here, there must be someone that they're afraid of, there must be a justice system in this country. You haven't described the guy, you haven't said he has gray hair and white skin and he's tall and so on, but you have described his existence based on the circumstances that you're experiencing. So a similar thing has occurred with regard to the knowledge of God. May he be honored and magnified, given to the multitude in all of the books of the prophets and also in the Torah. So when God is being described to the multitude, meaning all of the public in the Torah, when we read the Torah, and the Torah describes things which tell us of God, right? Necessity required that all of them be given guidance to the belief in the existence of God, right? All human beings, Rambam is saying very clear that everyone, all human beings, the smart intellectual ones, plus the normal folk, everyone needs to be introduced to the existence of God and his and in his possessing all the perfections. I mean, to say that Rambam makes it clear that all people need to know and understand that guidance to the belief that he does not merely exist as the earth as heavens do, that the existence of God is more than just saying the world exists. We can say, the world exists, right? The table in front of me exists, the heavens and the stars exist, and God exists, but there's two different things. But God is an existent, possessed of knowledge and power, that he has knowledge, and we're going to get to this because we right away you think, oh, does he mean God has a human type of knowledge? That's not what he means, but hold on for a second. That he's active, he actually interacts with this world, and having all the other characteristics that ought to be believed in with reference to his existence. This shall be made clear later on. Like I said, I'm going to go into what that means that God interacts with this world soon. Right. And we're going to get there in these coming chapters. OK, the minds of the multitude were accordingly guided to the belief that he exists by imagining that he is corporeal. So therefore, in order to guide them to that, the Torah describes him in such a way as if he had human characteristics, and to the belief that he is living by imagining that he's capable of motion. So by saying that God moves, it was described that way in the Torah in order to lead us to the ultimate belief and understanding that God can't be described in human terms, that he's something completely beyond that. And why is that? For the multitude perceive nothing other than bodies as having a firmly established existence. Because how are you going to describe something that exists? I used an example right away. I said, the table that's in front of me. Like if you and I are trying to prove that something's there, we're going to look around the room and say, well, we all agree that there's a chair there, right? Right? Or we all agree that you're there, right? I'm sitting here, you're sitting there, right? So, but anything that it is not a body, right? But subsists in a body is existent.
but its existence is more deficient than that of a body, as it requires a body in order to exist, right? That, however, which is so, in other words, right, we can all agree, and everyone, even the simple people, recognize something which is sitting in front of them, right, which is neither a body nor is not an existing thing in any respect, according to man's initial representation, particularly from the point of view of the imagination. So the Rambam is saying over here is that if something is not existent, right, something that we don't see, right, initially it's harder to prove. It's harder for us to explain to the general public what that thing is, right, or that it even exists. Similarly, the multitude do not represent to themselves. Simple, normal people don't understand the notion of life as anything other than motion. If you and I want to describe something that's alive, we describe, nowadays it might be a little different because we understand plants, say, as living beings, right? In Rambam's day, he would have put them on a category lower than living. Nowadays, we understand biology a little bit differently. But even plants do to some, they grow in the sense that they move in the sense that they grow, right? So life is perceived of by human beings as an object, as a being, a body, that motion, that moves, which is why God is described that way in the Torah. And consider that which has no local motion due to its will is not alive. If something doesn't decide to move and therefore move, that's not considered alive, despite the fact that motion doesn't pertain to the substance of the living. It's just something that it happens to do. How do we measure life? How do we see life according to Rambam? We see life by seeing something that moves. Does that mean that that's the definition of life? Of course not. The definition, life itself is not moving. Moving is just the way that we see it. And Rambam is getting closer. Therefore, the same thing, God himself is not XYZ description in the Torah, but we perceive God by seeing those things. That's where we're getting to. Similarly, apprehension, as it is habitually known among us, comes about through and how do we sense the motion? Through our senses, right? And Rambam is saying this, and this is why the Torah often uses our human senses to describe our perceptions of God. So motion, we perceive by seeing it, right? Smell, we perceive by smelling it. Sound, we perceive by hearing it. So similarly, we do not know, nor can we represent to ourselves how a notion can be transmitted from the soul of one individual who is among us to the soul of another individual when we describe a transference of knowledge from you to me, in the context, say, of this lecture right now, right? We talk about speech because that is the way, as human beings, I communicate knowledge to you and you communicate knowledge to me, is through speech. So when we describe God's communication of knowledge to human beings, we describe prophecy as if it is speech, because that's the way we perceive, right, the communication of knowledge from one being to another. But really, God's communication with human beings in terms of prophecy has nothing to do with what we perceive of as speech. Accordingly, as our minds are likewise guided to the belief that God may be exalted, apprehends that God understands, and that notions are communicated from him to the prophets in order that they should communicate them to us. He communicates messages to us through the prophets. He is described to us. That's why the Torah describes God as hearing and seeing. The meaning thereof being, what it really means is that there's some sort of apprehension and there's some sort of visual and audible things that appear to the person who's receiving it, but there's no actual speech happening. There's no, so again, Rambam is emphasizing, and this is the important part, that that this is why the Torah describes everything in ways, Dibur Torah Kalashim Bnei Adam. That's why the Torah consistently and constantly describes things in such human terms, even though there's no human anything actually happening here. He's also described us as speaking, the same idea, right? The meaning thereof, meaning notions communicated from God may be exalted to the prophets. This is the meaning of prophecy. And again, I know Rambam teases us a little. Later on, we shall be made extremely clear when he describes at length. One of the most famous parts of Rambam is where he describes the different levels of prophecy that exist. And these different levels are the levels through which God communicates with us. This is the meaning of, I'm sorry, I just said that. Again, as we have no intellectual cognition of our bringing, the only way you and I can understand it is through a direct act, right? I can't imagine having telepathy, somehow telepathically communicating knowledge to your brain, right? Maybe some people on the internet claim to have this ability, but the Rambam says that's not something that actually happens, right? The only way I can communicate to you is through some sort of an act, whether it's speech through writing. So therefore, we describe God as active. He, capital H, is described as active. We say God is doing things, but he's not actually doing things, because that, again, is a human way of describing something. Similarly, in view of the fact that the multitude, right, common people apprehend no living thing that is not endowed with a soul, right? We have a soul that enlivens us, that gives us life, that makes it the difference between a dead body and a human being that's alive, right? Even though the term soul, remember, we said we translated soul just 2-3 weeks ago. We talked about the meaning of the word soul. That's why God is also described as being alive, right? He's not alive in the same sense that you and I are alive. He doesn't have a soul in the same sense that you and I have a soul, but he's described that way because that's how we perceive life. That's how we perceive a being that's capable of action, of communication, and so on. Since with regard to us, the apprehension can be made that all of these acts are only performed by means of bodily organs. And then, furthermore, you and I, if I do something, I have to have done it with some organ of my body. So if I giving a speech right now, I'm doing it with my mouth, right? Or my tongue, my throat, whatever, my lungs. If I'm going to write something, I use my fingers and my keyboard. There's some sort of body that I'm using. So we therefore figuratively explain God as if he has body parts, and as if he's using those body parts in order to accomplish things, while obviously that has no relevance to actual God. I mean, the feet and their souls, the means by which hearing, seeing, and smelling come about, the eye, the ear, the nose, and so on and so forth. Speech in the matter of speech, the mouth, the tongue, the voice, and finally the means by which he among us who carries out his actions, those organs are the hands, the fingers, the palm, and the arm, and so on. To sum up all this, so Rambam's telling us, let's sum up this whole speech that I just gave you. God, may he be exalted above every deficiency, has had bodily organs figuratively ascribed to him in order that his acts should be indicated by that means. The reason why he's described this way, right? This is the secret of all the chapters we learned until now, where we learned that when it says speech, it doesn't mean speech, and so on. Why does the Torah describe it this way? Well, the reason why is because it's in order that his acts should be indicated by this means. And is because this is how we know, this is how we perceive, and this is a way for us to get a handle of understanding. Those particular acts are figuratively ascribed to him in order to indicate a certain perfection, which is not identical with the particular act mentioned. For instance, an eye, an ear, a hand, a mouth, a tongue have been figuratively ascribed to him, to God, so that by this means, sight, hearing, action, and speech should be indicated, right? We said God has an eye because we wanted to explain that God sees, but sight and hearing also aren't real. Those have figuratively been ascribed to him with a view to indicating apprehension in general. We said that God sees not because he actually sees, but because he apprehends. He knows what's going on, right? For this reason, you will find that Hebrew language substitutes the apprehension made by one sense for that made by another. And this is interesting because it somewhat contradicts a little bit what Chazal say. It's a famous Chazal that, it says by Sinai, when we received the Torah at Mount Sinai, it says, call them roim esakolos. They saw the sounds. And the Chazal say, what do you mean they saw the sounds? It was just a miracle that we saw things that are typically heard and heard things that are typically seen. Rambam is saying the same point, but it's actually, he's saying it jumbles those senses because it's not even the point. The Rambam says sometimes it says see the word of God, which is pasuk in Yirmiyahu, which is the same a point as hearing, right? The intended meaning is not to see with their eyes. God's word means apprehend, understand the meaning of his speech. The same thing, re'ei reach benhi, where Yitzchak says to his son, Isaac says to his son, when he was trying to, when Yaakov was trying to steal the blessings from his brother Esav, it says, Isaac says, I see the smell of my son. Well, Isaac was blind. Yitzchak was blind. He wasn't seeing anything. He was smelling something. But see meant there in the context of apprehend, understand, right? Refers to the apprehension of his smell. I just turned to page 100. And all the people saw the sounds, although this station also constituted a vision of prophecy, as is well known and universally admitted in our community. So, in other words, there's another Chazal which Rambam is alluding to, which is famous. Rashi mentions it too, when he says re'ei reach benir, see the smell. What Isaac was actually seeing was he was seeing the future of the generations and so on. So he was seeing a vision. So in that sense, But on the simple level, Rambam says, Re'eh re'ach bani, see the smell of my son. He's not seeing a smell. It's just trying to tell us and teach us that apprehension, the senses here are simply mean apprehend. You could use see, smell, hear, does feel, doesn't make a difference. The bottom line is you apprehend something. Action and speech are ascribed to God so that an overflow proceeding from him should thereby be indicated and shall be made clear further on, right? And similarly to God's perceiving things, when God does something and we sense an action that God does, right? It doesn't mean that he actually did something in the same way that you or I do something, right? But rather it means that an overflow that comes from godliness caused something to happen in this world. And then Rambam realizes right away that that's a big concept. I'll get to that in more detail later on, right? So because he kind of, like he always does, he kind of goes off on a tiny little tangent, stops himself, and then comes back. All bodily organs that you can find mentioned, this is repetitive, but it's repetitive because it's important. In all of the books of the prophecy are either organs of local motion mentioned with a view to indicating life, right? So in other words, seeing that God does things, or organs of sensation, meaning and indicating apprehension, that God apprehends things, or organs of prehension, which, things that do stuff, prehension like a hand or a foot, or organs of speech, which is communicating knowledge, right? The overflow of intellects towards the prophets, as will be made clear. The guidance contained in all these figurative senses is intended to establish in us the belief that there is, and the purpose of this all, and here's really the bottom line of this piece, is that we have to teach everyone to understand and believe that there is an existent who is living, and he is the agent who produces everything other than he, right? Ultimately, to know this knowledge by learning it and describing it in a simple-minded way for simple people like us to understand. The Torah had to describe it that way, but ultimately, if you study the whole Torah, you will get this main piece of knowledge and understand it and comprehend it, and that is that there is a God, right? And that God apprehends, knows, sees, does things, and everything that exists other than he himself is a result of his apprehension, his knowledge, his communication, etc., etc. When we shall begin to expound the negation of the attributes, right? So this is, we're going to do this soon in chapter 53. We'll get there in a couple of weeks, right? One of the most important concepts of the Rambam is, in order to understand God through negative attributes, we can't ever get to understand him, but as we kind of peel away the layers and say, he's not this, he's not this, he's not this, he's not this. And a lot of theologians have used this idea of the Rambam over the centuries to say, well, we can't understand God, but the more we understand what he's not, you can start getting closer and closer to that ultimate knowledge. But when we do that, when we discuss that in length, we shall make clear how all of this is reducible to one notion. Everything I just said, his actions, his communication, it all ends up as one, because God is the ultimate one, which is exclusively that of the essence of God himself may be exalted. And that one we'll never understand, like Rambam emphasized to us, and we had this several times. Ultimately, it all boils down to one, the unique oneness that can't be described, can't be understood by a human being. For the purpose of the present chapter is solely to make clear the meaning. But now let me get back to why I'm saying this now. Remember, Rambam has been leading us until now, showing us how all these terms, how all these words are supposed to be properly interpreted, not on the simple sense, not on their external sense, is to make clear the meaning of the bodily organ described to God, to describe why the Torah uses these terms to describe and may be exalted above every deficiency, and to explain that all of them are mentioned with the view and so on. And I'm going to finish this paragraph that, as the Torah, as the sages told us, the Torah speaketh in the language of the sons of man. Now, I want to stop here just to hear any comments about this idea. I just want to summarize just really quickly. The bottom line, the Rambam says, now that I told you all of these words and all these translations, right, why is it that the Torah describes God this way? Because that's the way human beings can start to get a handle on ultimately learning the ultimate concept, right? It's not meant to fool us or meant to make us think the simple level God, right, which the Rambam is trying to teach us is not the true God, the simple level God of an old man on a throne in the sky, right? But rather, it was described that way in order that we should eventually understand the true essence of God, which is that ultimate unique oneness, which can't be understood by us as people. let me stop here for a second. I need to catch my breath and have a sip of tea. But anyone would like to
I was
speak?
going.
Please go ahead. Yes,
I was
please.
asking about Mount Sinai. Hashem specifically tells Moses to tell the people that you did hear Hashem's voice, and yes, that was a one-time thing. But how would the Rambam explain that? When he
Well,
just says
Rambam
that
explains that as one of the levels of prophecy, and that when it says you heard, it means the communication. God communicated directly to us through this method of prophecy, which is the knowledge that somehow overflows. That was the Rambam's word, that overflows from God towards us, and we obtain that knowledge. But it doesn't mean we actually heard it with our ears. I mean, I wonder if there was a neuroscientist around at the time who had hooked up electrodes in our brain, if our hearing parts of our brain would have been stimulated, or maybe just somewhere deep in the middle of our brain where we're hearing, who knows? I don't know. That would be interesting. But Rambam probably would have said no, because we achieved a level of prophecy. When the Rambam describes the levels of prophecy, the level of the people at the foot of Mount Sinai is one of the levels of prophecy. Anyway, I'm sorry. Yeah, that was a good point. But anyone have any other comments?
Yeah, I have a small question. You went over it in your rephrasing very quickly, but I just want to turn the clock back just a moment. And it said, "I believe there is an existent who is living, is the agent," and there's a footnote. And here, who produces everything other than he? You went over who produces everything other than he. Those 8 words or 6 words.
Yes.
Obviously.
Very powerful.
Produces everything other than he. Could you take a minute or something? What does that mean?
Well, there's a lot jammed into those words. But the bottom line is that everything that exists, no matter what it is, whether it's in the heavens or the earth, in the core of the earth or in the core of the planet Jupiter or whatever exists, God made it exist, right? And he's responsible for that existing.
What about God? Because is there an implicit the way I would
that's
read
the
it,
essence of God we cannot understand, right? Right? We can never understand. If we try to figure out, okay, well, who created God or something like that? Right. I mean, it's a fun question to ask, but by its very definition, we cannot understand that. And Rambam made that. I have to remember which, like we did it like 4 or 5 weeks ago, where Rambam made it extremely clear that we be humble enough, right? It's an act of humility of us as human beings to look down at ourselves and say, we can't get that, and we never will. And someone who thinks that he can is already being a little or a lot arrogant, And that's the beginning of Avodah Zarah. That's how Rambam defines the beginning of idol worship. When we start thinking, I could manipulate God, I could control God, I could get a handle on God, and that's But we discussed that, and we're going to get to that more. But yeah,
it requires us to leap into a world where things happen without causes. That's my rephrasing.
Depends what you mean. Well, it depends what you mean, but God is the cause of everything. So to say that things happen
except him
himself. Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Well, I'll shelve all this.
Right. And if that's confusing, that's because we can't get it. So it's not where you can think about it if you want to, but you won't get anywhere.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other comments on what we've done so far? If there isn't, so then the Rambam is going to continue for a little bit, and let's just do this. The next, I'm on page 100 in the Pines. It's going to get a little specific. It'll get a little bit boring for about a page or so, but I made but let's do it. Okay. So it'll complete out the night. The organs of local motion ascribed to him on the bottom of page 100. So now he's going to give examples, right? So Rambam is always keen on giving these grand ideas, but he firmly does anchor his ideas in the words of the Torah. So here he goes. This from Isaiah, the stool of my feet, right? Hadom ragloi, right? Or the place of the soles of my feet, right? From Ezekiel, those are for 2 words of the prophets. right? So that, what does it mean? So when I told you, Rambam says that that the Torah uses terms, the prophets use terms to describe God, and that uses feet, that uses, the organs of prehension, of motion. Those are some examples. The organs of prehension described to him may be found in scriptural dicta such as these: the hand of the Lord, right? The etzba Elokim, right? The hand of the Lord is the yad Hashem, right? The work of thy fingers, right? And thou hast laid thine palm upon me, and so on and so forth. Example after example, where the Torah uses these, and it's clear, and Rambam is deliberately choosing verses where you don't have to, it does not a leap of faith to imagine that the Torah is describing it this way in order to, and it doesn't actually mean his hands, right? You look at it, the work of God's fingers, clearly it's not referring to God created the world with his fingers like a child, playing with Play-Doh or something. It means that God created it. He's just using those terms. The organs of speech, the mouth of the Lord has spoken, and he would open his lips against the voice of the Lord is powerful, so on and so forth. You can look up these verses, but it's clearly obvious that the organs of sensation, his eyes behold, his eyelids try the children of men, the eyes of the Lord run to and fro. Again, these are all many famous verses. And clearly they're using these terms, not because they actually mean his eyes, but because they want to bring us to an understanding of what God's truth is. And now he'll say we'll make this one point, and we'll, I think we'll end for tonight. But here, of the hidden parts of the body, however, we rarely hear God described of as a liver, or as a set of kidneys, or a set of lungs, right? But we do, the only time we hear, and this is one of the gutsy places where Rambam says, challenge me, right? The only time in the Torah, there's never any internal organ used to describe God other than the heart, which automatically all of the Bible experts are going to start thinking, let's see if this holds up. Well, Rambam said it, but he's going to give you he's going to make exceptions to his rule in a minute. So hold on. But for it is, but why the heart? Why is the heart is described to him? Because why? And here's the Rambam gives you the trick. Because the heart is an equivocal term, and you and I know what equivocal means, because the heart could mean a lot of things. The Rambam is telling us that when the Torah says heart in reference to God, it's not referring to the beating organ in the middle. It's referring to the heart is just a reference to intellect. Where the intellect resides within the body, so it could be anything, right? The heart doesn't mean the beating organ; it means our intellect. It means our internal knowledge, right? So, so therefore, when it uses other terms, right? For example, in your mio, right? My bowels are troubled for him. The trouble of thy bowels. It doesn't mean, it means the heart too, right? It's just referring to the sensation and the knowledge that we have inside ourselves. For bowel is a term in a general and particular sense, right? It's an equivocal term. In its particular sense, it's a term denoting the intestines, where in its general sense, it's a term denoting all the hidden parts of the body. It's the things that are within us, the things that we don't see, but the things that we experience internally. It is accordingly also a term denoting the heart. Now, remember, I discussed this a little bit, the whole debate between Plato and Aristotle as to whether the human intellect resides within the actual organ of the heart or the actual organ of the brain. And Aristotle was a heart guy. And since Rambam was an Aristotle guy, Rambam was more along the lines of a heart guy, right? Nowadays, we know it's the brain, but exactly, and what interaction the brain had with the heart, you can read, there's a lot of interesting articles out there. You can Google around and find it, but it's a famous debate between the heart guys and the brain guys, right? But it's been long since settled in modern medicine, and I hope you're aware of where the thoughts happen in modern medicine. But it actually has halachic relevance, and I mentioned this in a previous lecture. It has halachic relevance because many of the halachos of when we determine the time of death, we look at cardiorespiratory death when the heart stops beating, right? Now, many have argued with solid basis that the halachic idea of cardiorespiratory death being the definition of halachic death is based on not knowledge of the Torah, but it's based on this scientific understanding of the poskim that understood it that way for centuries. that the human soul is in the heart, thought is in the heart, and when the heart stops beating, we're dead. And if the heart's still beating, then we're not dead. However, one could make a very solid argument that once we learned and understood that the brain is where it is, that brain death is death. And I'm not, it's a strong position. And what it really hinges on is if you look at the halachic literature and see what was being brought as proof to advocate for cardiorespiratory death as being the definition of death. And if one looks at medieval literature, it is really, really solid argument could be made. Consistently, the Chacham Tzvi Ashkenazi, one of the major poskim of the 18th century, wrote a long treatise on this subject, which is one of the basis for cardiorespiratory death as being halachic definition of death. And his sources are Galen, a Roman physician, Aristotle. Like, his sources are old, ancient medical texts that are way outdated, page after page after page. He brings sources from earlier poskim who quoted those medical texts, which have been long since outdated. So a halachic position is based on a medical misunderstanding, which is historic. But it's a long subject. It's a favorite subject of mine. Maybe one day I'll give a lecture on the halachic definition of death. But it should come as no secret to you that I personally, and not just me, but many poskim fall strongly down on the side of the brain death as being a halachic definition of death. But it's a big subject and something we can leave for an interesting topic. But here Rambam is going with the heart, okay? And that's consistent, and that's fine, because that's how Rambam understood it, right? Thus, my heart troubles me. Similarly, a shoulder is not figuratively ascribed to him because, according to what is generally known, shoulder is usually considered an organ of transport. And because of the thing that is transported touches it. So we don't describe God as having a shoulder because nobody is riding on God, so to speak, right? All the more the organs of nutrition are not figuratively ascribed to him. When it talks about his bowels, Rambam said it was really referring to his insides, his heart, his thoughts. But the concept of putting nutrition as something in God, which just doesn't make any sense. So you won't find that anywhere being discussed. In truth, the status of all the organs is the same. It really doesn't matter, right? All of them, both the apparent and the hidden, being the organs required for various actions of the soul. The organs are just the way our soul manifests within our physical being. Some of them are organs, and so actually we should probably leave this to next time and start from here, because he's going to go on and start making more points. But welcome to the heavy philosophical parts of Rambam, because he gave us the foundations and the basis in the last 30 weeks of lectures, and now we're going into the meat of how Rambam starts to help us make sense of it all, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So anyway, I'm going to open the floor for any comments before we end today's lecture. Anyone else want to have any questions, issues, comments? Well, if there isn't, then we'll regather next week and we'll continue our study. Be well. Have a good Shabbos. Take care.
Good night.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.